Hello and welcome. In this video we'll be taking a look at the shore-based landing techniques in the RAZBAM AV-8 Harrier II. Now, the short landing is probably the most commonly used way of getting back to the ground in the Harrier, especially when returning to base with remaining ordnance. It's also easier to perform than vertical landing, but there are two types, more basic types of short landing. So we'll go through those now and then we'll get on to the vertical stuff. So there are two main versions of the slow landing, and they can be broken down into two subcategories each. So we'll start with fixed nozzle slow landing, or FNSL, and this is used in environments where maximum performance isn't necessary, and it gets its name from the fact that the pilot sets the nozzles and doesn't adjust them until after touchdown. Most FNSLs are performed with flaps set to STOL. That's because it's easy to perform, less costly on fuel than other types. However, when crosswinds exceed 15 knots during the day or 10 knots during the night, an alternative version of the FNSL can be chosen with flaps set to auto, and that's recommended for landings with high stores asymmetries. So we'll get on to the first fixed nozzle, which is the STOL flaps. So we're making the approach, checking our STOL stopper is fully aft, and we will make the approach at 800 feet at 350 knots. So once the end of the runway disappears under the nose of the aircraft, we will make a turn, pulling at 10 units of angle of attack and throttling back, slowing the aircraft down about 180 degrees parallel to the runway, and you want to be below 250 knots, ready to get the aircraft dirty. Okay, so we're pulling out of the turn now. We're going to check that we are roughly parallel to the runway. We're going to drop our landing gear, set our water tank to landing, and set our flaps to STOL. Next we're going to switch our HUD over to VSTOL mode, and then we will get ready to turn in on base leg. Nozzles are now set to 60 degrees, and that's where they will remain for the duration of the flight. Now we need to concentrate on two symbols on the HUD as we make our approach to finals. This one here, which is the witch's hat, which is set at 8 degrees nose up from the horizon. This will help you in pointing the aircraft where you want to go, and also to help with the descent. And the other one is the vertical velocity indicator, and basically this works like I guess like a cyclic on a helicopter, and if you throttle up, the symbol will raise and the feet per minute reading will climb, and if you decelerate, it will drop, and it will obviously go into the negative for feet per minute. Now what we want to do is to try and combine the two symbols so that we have a nice slow steady descent as we turn into finals, so that we have the best control that we can have on the aircraft. We don't want to be going too fast, because obviously we're just going to lose control, and if we're going too slow we're going to drop like a stone. So the idea is to keep it at a nice steady descent. So using these two symbols in combination, we should get a nice result. So as you can see, I try not to let it drop below 1,000 feet per minute on the negative side. So yeah, around about 400 feet per minute, keeping the nose down slightly. As you can see, we've got 7 units of angle of attack, and we're coming in nice and slow. And as we get close to the runway, we are going to level out and put the witch's hat a couple of degrees above the horizon so that we have a nice gentlish touchdown. As we hit terra firma, we're going to throttle right back, put the nozzles all the way to 98%, and then we're going to throttle up and gently apply some toe brake, performing a power brake. Once we've slowed down to taxi speed, we can then throttle back again, nozzle out to 0 degrees, release the toe brakes, and then taxi back to the pan. So that was your common conventional slow landing. So now we can move on to our next one, which will be the auto flaps fixed nozzle slow landing. So this is going to be pretty much similar to the STOL flaps fixed nozzle slow landing, obviously with the addition that the flaps are now in auto mode. So let's get into that one. So it's going to be the same approach as we did before, flying in at 350 knots at 800 feet. Once the runway disappears under the nose of the aircraft, we're going to bank again to 10 units of angle of attack, all the while throttling down and keeping that turn until we're parallel to the runway, and we get to below 250 knots, and at that stage we get the aircraft dirty once again. So we're going to get the aircraft dirty again. We are going to drop the gear, we're going to set the water tank to landing, and then we're going to set the flaps to auto, not STOL. Then we're going to set the HUD master mode to VSTOL, and then we're going to put the nozzles to 60 degrees. You may have noticed that I'm not completely parallel to the runway. That's because I've performed a teardrop just to give myself a little bit of extra room, as the flaps are now in auto mode, so things will be slightly different, and it just gives me that little bit of extra time and space to maneuver to get in line with the runway. So there we go, we've switched over to VSTOL mode, and we're going to bring it in using the witch's hat and vertical velocity indicator on the HUD again, just to bring it into a nice gentle approach. Now the reason why this approach is done with auto flaps is purely because if you're approaching and there's high crosswinds or when high stores asymmetry is present, this landing will require higher approach speed and landing rollout. So that is why the auto flaps are selected. I mean, you can see in the HUD that the approach speed is around about 40 knots faster than the STOL flap variant, and I also set this landing for a side wind of 10 knots at 132 degrees, so I've got a nice 10 knot crosswind blowing across the runway. So again, as we approach the ground, we want the witch's hat a couple of degrees above the horizon. Once we hit the ground, throttling right back, set the nozzles to 98%, throttle up, a touch of toe brake. Once we get down to taxi speed, throttle down again, nozzles to 0, release the toe brakes, and then we are able to taxi back to the pan. So just to summarise, if you're coming back to base with a stores asymmetry, or if you know there's a crosswind, a high crosswind, then the best approach for that would be a fixed nozzle, slow landing with auto flaps. Okay, so on to slow landing variant number 2, which is the variable nozzle slow landing. This is less common, but provides maximum performance on wave-off margins, especially at high field elevations in hot weather or when bringing back a lot of ordnance. In this case, the pilot sets a specified power setting and performs slight trial and error variations of nozzle angles to maintain a steady optimum angle of attack. Again, the recommended VNSL is conducted with STOL flaps, but requires a power setting high enough that the nozzles won't need to be set less than 50 degrees, so that the STOL flaps do not raise inadvertently, but low enough that you will still have power available for a wave off if necessary. The alternate version is conducted with auto flaps and is used for VNSL RPM settings below 90%, or in the event of an emergency such as stuck throttle below 90% or an oil caution. So this is the STOL flap variable nozzle slow landing, and has a good maximum performance on wave off margin. It's good for when coming back to a high field elevation during hot weather or with a heavy ordnance load. Now we've got the same approach again, 350 knots at 800 feet. I'm going to check to make sure the STOL stopper is fully aft. Again, once we get to the end of the runway, once it disappears below the nose, we will pull 10 units of angle of attack, throttle back, and get the aircraft below 250 knots, get the aircraft parallel with the runway on downwind, and then we can get our aircraft dirty. Right, so we're now parallel to the runway on downwind. We're going to drop our gear. We're going to set the water tank to landing as per usual, and we are going to set the flaps to STOL. Then we're going to set the HUD master mode to VSTOL, and this is where things get slightly different. This time we're going to set the throttle to between 90 and 100%. We're going to set the nozzles to between 50 and 60 degrees. All the while we are going to try and battle with the aircraft to keep it in a nice steady descent as we turn base leg and onto finals. This can be done obviously varying the nozzles, and as long as you don't go below 50 degrees you should be okay, as that's when you'll start to get into trouble. As you remember, this is for situations where you possibly have a throttle stuck below 90%. So we're going to make our base leg now, giving myself plenty of room and time to get down and lined up for finals. As you can see, we are about 30 knots faster than we would be if this was a fixed nozzle slow landing, so we do need to bear that in mind, that we are coming a bit quicker. and we need to make sure that we use the nozzles to our advantage as well. Now remember, having made this approach without touching the throttle, just using the nozzles to slow the aircraft down, we will get the nose above the horizon. Once we get down on the ground, throttle right back. Again, nozzles all the way to 98%, throttle up, touch your toe brake, bring the aircraft down to taxi speed, throttle down, nozzles to 0, and then we can make our way to the pan to park up. So I'm now going to reset so we can do this again in auto flaps. So auto flaps variable nozzle slow landing is mostly used in emergencies, notably when RPM setting is below 90% for any reason, or during an oil caution. So we're going to brake overhead, 800 feet, 350 knots as per usual. Again, we're going to bank 10 units of angle of attack, all the while pulling back down on the throttle to slow it down to below 250 knots and to get it parallel for the downwind to the runway. So we are on our downwind. We're going to put the gear down, water tank to landing, and flaps to auto, HUD master mode to V-STOL. Then this time we're going to set the throttle to between 80% and 90% and the nozzles between 40 and 50 degrees. Now the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that I've performed yet another teardrop. That's just purely my preference, just to give me a little bit more room and a little bit more time to make adjustments, and so that I don't overshoot on the finals. Now bearing in mind that the aircraft is in auto flaps, the approach will be a little bit faster than it would be if it was in STOL flaps, so you need to remember that it's critical not to put the nozzles below 50 degrees. As long as you keep the nozzle position above 50, you should be okay for the approach. If you start dropping it below the 50 degrees, you will start to run into issues as the aircraft will gain speed, because you need to remember that this is for a possible stuck throttle situation. So using the nozzles to your advantage is the main aim of this type of landing. Now remembering that this type of landing would be used in an emergency, there's not much I can do about my approach speed. Admittedly, it's probably quicker than it should have been, but I'm getting the aircraft down. Now we need to get the nose a couple of degrees above the horizon, throttle back, the nozzles to 98%, throttle up, toe brakes for a big power brake. We've missed our turn off, which we have used in previous ones. We can throttle down now and put the nozzles back to 0 as we now approach the taxi speed. we can now put the water tank into neutral and the flaps up into cruise for taxiing, and we're all clean, and we can taxi back to the dispersal up the end here. But yeah, that was the auto flaps variable nozzle slow landing. So just to bear in mind that this, as I said before, would be used in an emergency situation. So these aren't used, that they're not very common. In fact, they're quite rare. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. I believe that, yeah, this is the last of our slow landings, so we'll be going now on to vertical landings. And now we move on to the Harrier's party piece, the vertical landing. It's important to bear in mind that this is the kind of landing the Harrier was designed to perform. The geometry of its landing configuration is thus arranged to optimize vertical landing control and reference. Vertical landings, or VLs, are the only types of landings allowed on ships and will regularly be performed on deployments. Some forward arming and refueling points, or FARPs, will also only be accessible via vertical landing. Getting back on the ground may seem daunting at first, but with practice it will become second nature of any Harrier pilot. The 3 golden rules of VLs are the same as for the takeoffs, which is 1. Always land into the wind, 2. Always land on flat terrain, and 3. Do not exceed the maximum landing weight of 20,500 pounds. Follow these and you'll be good. So we are going to perform a brake as usual, 350 knots at 800 feet. Again, once the runway disappears under the aircraft's nose, we will brake, pulling 10 units of angle of attack, all the while decelerating to below 250 knots until we are parallel with the runway for downwind, and then we will settle the aircraft and start to get it dirty. Okay, so we're going to settle out on the downwind. I'm going to perform a slight teardrop, so I've got some extra room to manoeuvre. Gear down, water tank to landing, flaps to STOL. We're going to put the HUD master mode into V-STOL, and then we are going to set our nozzles to 60 degrees. We're also going to set the altimeter to radar with the switch under the UFC. As we're trying to slow down, you may have heard that the RPMs went up. That's obviously just to keep the aircraft in a nice steady slow descent as we come in. Obviously we're not powering forward, we're trying to keep the aircraft in the air. So a normal approach as usual, giving yourself plenty of space and time to approach the landing area. And all the while remembering that the witch's hat and VVI in the HUD will become your 2 best friends in this manoeuvre. The lateral movements will be very sensitive, so try to keep it as stable as possible, keeping these 2 HUD symbols as steady as possible. Again, the vertical velocity indicator is like the cyclic of a helicopter, so you want to keep a little bit of power on in this manoeuvre, because we are going to be moving the nozzles slowly into the hover stop of around 82 degrees, and we don't want to slip into a rapidly increasing descent. So keeping those two symbols roughly together, keeping your eye on the feet per minute indicator. Don't want to slip below 500 if possible. As you can see, it wobbled slightly there. Just remember to take your time, don't rush, try and stay relaxed, just let it all flow. As you can see, I'm very slowly raising the witch's hat so that we are bringing the forward momentum to an almost stop so that we can get into the hover, but we will have to apply a little bit more power. As you can see, it does get a little bit twitchy. I'm no expert at this, so just trying to keep it still is a challenge. Down to 16 knots, we can start to slowly descend. As you can see, we're dropping the power slightly. As soon as the wheels touch the ground, power down. We can tidy up, we can put the water back into neutral, we can put the flaps into cruise so we can taxi, and we can also zero out the nozzles, and then we can taxi back to the ramp. A nice easy vertical landing there, or almost vertical. It wasn't perfect, but you get the idea. Now this last one seems to be in a category of its own, and is known as the precision rolling vertical landing. This is a subtype of rolling vertical landing specially adapted to conditions pilots may encounter at forward operating bases, such as if there's been a bombing, there's not much of a runway, and you're slightly too heavy for a vertical landing. Then this sort of landing would be, I guess, be used in that type of situation. So let's roll into it. So bumbling in at 350 knots at 800 feet as usual. Once the runway disappears under the nose of the aircraft, we will make our turn. Checking the stow stopper to make sure it's fully aft. Now we're going to make our turn, pulling at 10 units of angle of attack, all the while pulling back on the throttle to bring the speed back down to 250 knots, and we are going to get parallel on the downwind so we can get the aircraft dirty. Checking to see if we're parallel to the runway. I'm going to put the gear down, water to landing, and flaps to auto. Setting the HUD master mode to V-STOL, setting our altimeter to radar, and then moving our nozzles to 60 degrees to slow the aircraft down. Powering up in the turn to maintain our steady descent, and just keeping an eye on where the end of the runway is. So I'm aiming for the latter half of the tyre marks at this end of the runway here, and what I'll be doing is I'll be pointing my side slip indicator on the HUD at the front end of the tyre marks, and this will give me a shallow approach into where I want to be. Now, similar to the vertical landing, we start manipulating the speed with the nozzles, but we are in auto flaps, so the speed is always going to be slightly faster than it would be with STOL flaps. So we need to maintain a speed of around 60 knots as we approach. So I'm going to start aiming the side slip indicator on the front end of the tyre marks. As you can see, I'm trying to manipulate it there, and then I will bring the throttle down, keep the descent at 60, well, about 65 knots here, and as we approach I'll slowly lift the nose up and then bring it in as if we were doing a normal auto flaps fixed nozzle slow landing. But because we're already doing around 60 knots, our rollout will not be as long as it would be on a normal approach on a slow landing. So as we touch down, we throttle right back, apply the brakes, and there you have it. That's the precision rolling vertical landing. I haven't rolled off of the tyre marks, so all we need to do now is clear the aircraft up, put the flaps into cruise, turn the water tank off, and then we're good to go. I've applied the parking brake as you would in a situation where the airfield would be attacked and you wouldn't be able to manipulate, so this would be where I'd either get towed to a dispersal or a hide somewhere, and then be rearmed, refueled, or whatever would need doing to the aircraft. So there you go. That's just an extra one I threw in, the precision rolling vertical landing. I wasn't going to do it, but as it's something somewhat different in a category in between vertical landing and slow landing, I thought I would add it. But there you go. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.